everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every week, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. If you'd like to join us live, you'll find the schedule for upcoming sessions on my website at lindanickell.com. Every week, my guests share their photography tips and insight into their creative journeys, and they inspire us to look at a subject a little differently. Before we get started tonight, I want to take a minute and congratulate a couple of my former guests and dear friends who were recognized for their outstanding wildlife photography at the Natural History Museum of London. With over 59,000 entries from around the world, Wildlife Photography of the Year recognition was awarded to Rick Beldegreen. You can check out his session 75, which was creating unique images. Vince Maidens, who's done 2 sessions for me, 98, which was all about owls, and 183, which was true to the lens, the art of authenticity in wildlife photography. And Karen Agner, who's done several presentations for me. In 2023, Karen took home the grand prize and again won this year for the category behavior. Karen will be at Happiness Hour Live on March 15th in Georgetown, Texas. So if you're in Central Texas or if you're willing to travel, I hope that you'll consider joining us. So please take a moment and check out their sessions on the YouTube channel, where you'll find links to their socials in the show notes. Tonight, my guest is Tony Baldasaro. Tony is a New England-based wildlife and landscape photographer, a photography workshop instructor, and he offers mentoring and one-on-one coaching. Tony's landscape portfolio is filled with photographs he made using the best light that nature could offer him, while his wildlife expertise allows us an opportunity to view critters and wild birds in their natural habitat. In tonight's presentation, Wild Bird Photography, Tips to ensure sharp focus and impactful images. Tony will share some of his best tips and tricks for planning, executing, and post-processing to help you be more successful in photographing birds and improving your skill set to increase the number of photos worth keeping that celebrate these beautiful birds. You can connect with Tony through his website at tb3photography.com. You can subscribe to his brand new YouTube channel, TB3 Photography. And if you're on Instagram, you can find him at TB3_photo. Welcome to the Happiness Hour, Tony.
Thank you, Linda. That was very kind, and I very much appreciate those words. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really, really appreciate the invite, and just so happy that we've made that connection out of Chicago so many years ago, and can bring that forward today.
Yeah, it's kind of a full circle thing. I think I was telling you earlier, the Happiness Hour, you are number 217 tonight. And I had actually recorded the first one just before Out of Chicago did that first live conference. And everybody was like, what is Zoom? And I'm like, I kind of know what it is because I've been doing it with my friends. But now it's just our main, I mean, we do it every day, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And this is the best. I mean, this is such a great platform. You're sitting in New Hampshire. I'm in Texas. We have people in this room that are in New Jersey, California, Michigan, Idaho, and I'm forgetting who else is in the room. I'm from Texas, so a lot of people are here in Texas. But we would not have that opportunity to get to listen to your presentation if we didn't have this platform. And you weren't willing to say yes. So thank you for not putting up a fight. And I'm very, very excited to have you here as a presenter. And I can't wait to see what you share with us.
Oh, thank you. And saying yes was the easy part. So thank you so much. Yeah, it is a really interesting world we live in. And I remember somebody a long time ago saying to me, you're never the smartest person in the room if you're connected to the internet. And you're never, I guess nowadays, you're never without a friend if you don't have the opportunity, if you don't have Zoom, right? You have the chance to meet in these types of places. So Well, thank you, everybody. I am really excited to be here. I'm really excited to share my interest and passion in bird photography. As Linda mentioned, I primarily focus on landscapes and wildlife, although technically my wildlife work really centers around wild birds. Um, well, goodness, I guess it's 30 years ago now when I was in college. I was a biology major and studied ornithology. So my interest in birds really goes back a long ways. Now it's, coming up on and probably passing 3 decades, which makes me feel really, really old as I say that, but it's still it's been a part of who I am and what I do for a really long time. And then the ability to sort of marriage my interest in photography and birds has really been a lot of fun. So I'm happy to be here and I'm really excited to share something that I'm really interested in. So let's get started. Let me just change my screen settings real quick. Okay. As Linda mentioned earlier, I really do a lot of landscape work. I live on New England near the coast of New Hampshire, which puts me within close proximity to a lot of really outstanding places. I'm a few miles from Maine, a few miles from Massachusetts, and then obviously being in New Hampshire, I'm able to participate and be a part of the New Hampshire scene, which is from a outdoors perspective and from a photography perspective can be really rich. I have been in education for 30 years. Recently semi-retired to become a professional photographer educator, which is what I'm doing now. Um, but that combination of teaching and photography is what I love to do the most. And so to have the opportunity to speak at things like this and other events and to coach and to help other folks is kind of who I am at this point. Um, one of the things I'm really excited about tonight is I'm going to primarily show you some New England birds. So I know a lot of you, I don't know if any of you have visited New England a whole bunch. We just spoke a moment ago about some people that have visited, but we're going to focus a little bit on shooting some New England birds, which I hope is exciting for folks because while yes, a lot of these birds you probably may see in your backyards as well, some of them you may not. For example, some of the winter birds they may not make it down to the southern parts of the states, and so I'm really hopeful that I'm able to share some new and exciting birds with you guys tonight. So this is probably the first what I would credit as my first attempt at taking a photograph of a wild bird. This is a snowy owl. The snowy owls come down to New England during the winter months. They should hopefully, fingers crossed, be arriving sometime in early December. Their arrival every year is based on the population of the owls in the Arctic. If they have a good year and there's a large population of snowy owls, what happens is generally the females and or the young owls really get outcompeted up in the north, and so they have to travel further south and they come into New England, and sometimes they will even make their way down the coast of the east coast of the United States. So last year we only had one or two owls that made it to New England last year, which tells us that they didn't really probably have a strong year in terms of reproduction and producing more owls. And so it was a pretty lean year for snowy owls last year. Several years ago, we had somewhere near 180 along the coast of New Hampshire during the course of the winter. So it does vary quite a bit from year to year. So we're hopeful that we're going to have a strong year. Some of the early indications are that they are beginning to move down this way. So that looking forward to that. But this is again the first image that I took, and I was so proud of it at the time. And as I zoom in on it, you can kind of see, boy, it's not necessarily the type of photography that I would really like to engage in these days. But still, it really was sort of that moment where I was like, oh, these are pretty cool to photograph. As I said to you, or as I said at the beginning of this, I've always been interested in birds, and my interest in landscape photography is has been around for more than 2 decades now. And then about a decade ago or so, I was like, oh boy, this bird thing is really kind of interesting. Now, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, one of the barriers to entering into wildlife and wild bird photography is the cost, because the lenses and whatnot can get pretty expensive, which I'll talk about. And so like most people, I think my entry into photography was really with landscapes and whatnot, because you can go out and get your kit lens and really do a lot of work just with your kit lens. Now, this is my most recent bird image. This was taken just several days ago. Actually, I apologize. I forgot to change the date on this. This was taken Sunday morning. No, Monday morning, excuse me. So let's see, today's Wednesday. So this was just 2 days ago over on the coast. This is what's called the gray ghost. This is an adult male northern harrier. The the juveniles are more brown in color and somewhat have some rust in them. And as they get older, as they enter into their third and fourth year, the males will turn into these beautiful gray birds. And they are somewhat rare in that A, you have to have a male that lives long enough to make it to their fourth year, and B, they are pretty they're just not very out very often, and that's probably why they've survived. They've survived there for several years, is because they're pretty savvy about when they fly and where they're going to fly. So to have the opportunity to not only see one but photograph one just the other day was, a lot of fun, to be honest with you. And you can see, as I zoom in on this guy, just the level of crispness to this image that compared to the snowy owl I showed you a moment ago, kind of this, describes for you visually the 10-year journey I've had in working on my bird photography. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, this was a bird I took about a year ago, and one of the things I want to point out to you is the ISO of 25,600. I'm going to talk about this later on in my presentation, but the reason I'm showing it here is because the sort of maturation of my photography over the last 10 years has coincided with the maturation of equipment, so that you can actually go out and shoot at what used to be an outrageous thought of shooting at ISO 25,000. But really nowadays, with modern cameras and modern post-processing, you can really stretch your camera to its fullest and maximum limits in order to create the images that you want to create, which I couldn't do 10 years ago. So sort of keep this image in mind, because I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. But here's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to go through the first part of this pretty quickly, the first section, which is the apps. I'm going to talk about equipments and settings for quite a bit, because the settings are really important. I kind of pride myself on being relatively equipment agnostic, because I don't know if you have to, I don't think you need to buy a specific type of brand of camera and lens to be able to be a successful wild bird photographer. But you do have to make sure that cameras that you do use have some specifications and some settings that you're able to use. We're going to talk about composition. I think as any good photographer would think about, you have to be thinking about composition. And then I'm not going to go through my post-processing technique, but I have taken some screenshots of some of the things that I do in post-processing. So you've got a sense of what that looks like. But we don't have time to go into Lightroom and do all of that. That would be really a whole other night if we were to do that. So let's start talking a little bit about some of the apps that I use, and I'll open these up here so you can see them all at one time. So, there are a number of apps that I'm going to use in addition to being a member of the Audubon Society and, getting emails and literature from them. I will also, on my phone, use an app called eBird and an app called Merlin. eBird is it's a social site for birders, where you can log the birds that you've seen, where you've seen them, what the conditions might have been, and then you can also have access to what other people have seen, what birds elsewhere. And so if you're looking for a specific bird to photograph or just to get on your life list, you can go to eBird and find where they've been found in the past. You can also learn about different patterns and whatnot to the birds that are coming. It's a great resource. It's done by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, as you can see there in that upper left-hand corner. It's a wonderful place. It also does a nice job of protecting birds that may be a bit vulnerable. So, for example, if there's a non-native species, we were talking earlier about a flamingo in Texas, I think it was, that if somebody was supposed to have an eBird, my guess is they would probably not say where it was found. eBird would hide the location to protect the bird and its vulnerabilities of obviously a whole bunch of people showing up and perhaps destroying the environment or what have you. So it does a nice job of protecting the birds that are more vulnerable than others. But otherwise, it's a great place to be able to find where birds have been found, what sort of the locations of the birds might be, what patterns they have. So it's really a useful tool, as well as you can log your own bird stats. Merlin is an app that I use while in the field, and it actually, let me pull that back up. It'll actually identify the birds that are singing around you. And so if you're out, this is great during migration season, especially in the spring or just after the birds arrive. You can go out with Merlin and you can turn Merlin on, and it'll tell you the birds that you're hearing. So in addition to verifying with your own ear, you have your phone now that can help identify the birds that are nearby. So that's always nice. During migration seasons, I'll use a website called Birdcast, which will tell me not only how many birds are in flight during the evening or the night before, but where they're going, what their general patterns are. It'll also, in fact, go down into, and this is, if you look closely, this is Rockingham County in New Hampshire. This is where I live. And it's telling me on the night of May 3rd, 2022, there were 56,000 birds that crossed over into Rockingham County overnight. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, it's going to tell me, based on historical data, what birds probably came in overnight. Now, it doesn't know specifically that these birds arrived, but based on past migration patterns, these are the birds that would have arrived in Rockingham County overnight. So, excuse me, if I wake up in the morning and Birdcast tells me that 200,000 birds arrived overnight, I know it's good. I have a good chance of seeing some birds that day. And we're not going to do a whole lot about bird migration here, but birds are most active in the morning because they fly overnight. So they have to spend the morning refueling, and then they quiet down during the day to rest for their migration going into the evening that night. So uh, in the morning when they first arrive, that's when they're most active, and that's when they want to be, when you want to be around. And you can see this is an example from September 26th. We had 480,000 birds that crossed over into Rockingham County. So you can have a tremendous amount of activity in it any given night. And I'm sure down in Texas or wherever you all are, New Hampshire is very small. And so I'm sure in bigger parts of the world, you're going to have numbers that are much larger than that. Then I have to say that one of, as sad as this looks, maybe the best way to find the birds is to have conversations with people. We have a little bit of a joke up here in New Hampshire. If you want to find a snowy owl, just look for the cars and then look for the tripods, out, either taking pictures of it or looking at it. And there are locations, I'm sure you could do this wherever you are as well, when you're driving around and you might see throngs of photographers somewhere. And, hopefully everybody's being respectful of the bird and of the space and what have you, all of those things. But it's also an opportunity for you to have conversations with people that are there. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had conversations with people while we've been photographing a bird or waiting for a bird or, in a location like this. And now all of a sudden you have a new friend and you have, the opportunity to learn something from somebody new that you didn't know before you showed up there. So while nobody likes this, nobody really wants to see throngs of people crowding a bird, obviously. They do present opportunities for you to make new connections, to learn new, bird sightings or new locations or whatever it may be, and maybe most importantly, make new friends. So let's talk a little bit about equipment now. I wanted to kind of go over some of those things really quickly. Again, we can do a whole night on just how to find the birds and what to do, but I think we really want to get into equipment and settings. And as I mentioned earlier, I really do want to be gear agnostic. I happen to shoot in the Canon systems. And the only reason I shoot Canon is because whatever it was, 25, 30 years ago when I was buying my first DSLR, I had a friend who also was buying, and he had done a whole bunch of research and he knew what my price point was. And he said, okay, here are the two cameras you can buy. Here's the Nikon and here's the Canon. Go check them out. And the Canon, I did that. And literally the Canon was more comfortable in my hand. And that's why I bought the Canon. And then I started buying gear to go with the Canon, the lenses and all of that stuff. And I don't know about you, but I don't have, the wherewithal to throw my Canon equipment away and go out and buy a whole bunch of new equipment in Nikon or Sony or anything like that. So that's really the only reason I've stuck with Canon. I mean, I've been really happy with it. But nowadays, whether you're shooting on Canon, maybe the OM system, maybe it's Sony, maybe it's Nikon, whatever system you're shooting, the ability of these systems to be able to do what I'm going to talk about is pretty much universal. And so I don't think you need to go out and you need to buy Canon equipment to be able to do the things that I'm going to be talking about. It just happens to be the equipment that I have, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the specifications that you're going to want to have here. So obviously, speed is a big thing. Especially for birds in flight to freeze action, you're going to want to have the ability to shoot in bursts. My camera shoots at about 30 frames per second when it's shooting electronically. And if you have a lens that you can shoot as low aperture, have super fast glass, that's great too. So speed, reach, you got to be able to reach out, I think at least 300 millimeters. Nowadays, you can buy a 150 to 600 millimeter lens for relatively, short money. I'm not saying it's not expensive, but $1,500, $1,000, maybe not 1,000, but certainly on the used market, you could. If you want to go start getting into the prime lenses, then that's a whole different conversation, but you certainly can extend your reach. And if you have an extender, I use a 1.4 extender, which gives me 40% more reach. I would not recommend the 2.0 extender because it does slow things down quite a bit. But that being said, if you have success with it, you can. Also, if you have a crop sensor, that's going to get you a little bit more perceived reach as well. And so that can be a good thing. If you don't have a crop sensor, I would recommend you get a full frame sensor with a lot of megapixels because and regardless of whether you have a crop sensor or a full frame sensor, um, you're going to be cropping your photos, in post processing anyway, because birds just aren't going to want to get that close to you many times, and so there is a lot of cropping that takes place. Um, the newer cameras have eye detect software on it, so if you can lock in on the eye and your camera can lock in on the eye for focusing, that is fantastic. And so I would recommend if you're in the market for a good camera now, if it doesn't have eye detect software, I would probably not buy that at this point. I'd probably be looking for something with eye detect. And then I can't tell you the number of times, I'm going to go back to this image right here. Can't tell you the number of times that I've seen people go out with big cameras, big lenses, and then the cheapest tripod that they can find. That if you take a look at the lower camera on here, that's my, R5 body with the 600 prime lens. And I'm not saying this, I'm just saying this to say this. Those two pieces right there are about $18,000. I'm not going to put $18,000 on a $100 tripod. So I'm going to spend money on a good, durable tripod, and I'm going to spend money on a gimbal head like you can see here that gives me all sorts of flexibility to shoot. And I know people aren't necessarily excited about spending $1,000 to $1,500 on a tripod, but that's much better than buying a cheaper tripod and having it fall over in your equipment break. And so you've invested in the lenses, you've invested in the camera, invest in the tripod as well. We're going to get into some of these settings a bit more specifically here in a little bit. I generally almost always shoot in manual mode, but you can shoot in aperture priority mode. I guess you could even shoot in shutter speed mode, but I never really do that, or shutter speed priority. So I'm almost always in manual mode, and that's what I'll focus on today. If you have the ability to turn your back button focus on and have it in servo or continuous focus mode, you want to do that. You don't want to use single focus mode, or I forget what the other terms are, but you really want to make sure that once your camera is locked in on the subject, that it stays locked in on that subject and remains in focus while the bird is in flight or moving around or whatever the case may be. And I would recommend back button focus because all I have to do is just with my thumb really quickly press those buttons and have my bird in focus immediately. And then when I'm ready, I can trigger it with my forefinger, the shutter with my forefinger. Metering is spot or partial, partial meaning that some cameras will give you the ability to maybe choose several spots around a single spot. And so but I would not go with matrix metering or entire metering. I want to make sure that I'm metering mostly on the head and the eye of the bird as much as possible. And then we're going to focus on the following three pieces here: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And so we're going to get into some detail on those. So we're going to do a little bit of geeky stuff here for a little bit because we need to talk about these pieces as we talk about settings some more. I have a video here that I want to show you. I think this is going to play if I did this right. What back button and ID software does for you. And so again, by putting your camera does not come with back button focus automatically, so you have to go in and program the back button to work. And so now what you're doing is you're using a thumb to focus the camera. But let's go ahead and so what's happening here, you're going to see, oh shoot, sorry about that. So what's going to happen here is this square right here is what I'm focusing on. And every once in a while, you're going to see a little blue square pop up. And when you see that blue square, let's see if I can stop it on the blue square. Oh, there it was right there. When you see that blue square, that means it's the eye detect software has been triggered. Okay, so you're seeing changes here. And so what I've done is focusing on this tree, which is maybe 50 meters behind where a bird is. And you're going to see the bird show up here in just a second. So we're going to come over here. We're going to find something to focus on. And then we're going to come over here. We're going to hit our eye detect. And notice how that eye detect immediately finds the eye and the bird. So this is, and what you're seeing here is my thumb going from regular focus to whatever focus I have setting to and all in back button. I'm just moving my thumb a little bit over to the right and I'm pressing, and now I'm using my eye detect software. So I'm using the regular focus of the camera to kind of zero in on the location roughly. And then I go to eye detect software to actually key right in on the bird. And now all of a sudden I'm locked in on the bird. And every time this sort of flashes, that's when I'm actually taking a shot. And so this ability to go back and forth between the regular focus on my camera to the eye detect and having that in the back button, just to move it over my thumb over just a little bit of an inch, like a quarter of an inch, is going to allow me to get super sharp shots all the time and very quickly. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create and I'm going to use custom modes in my camera to kind of set my settings up before I even get out into the field. Almost all cameras now come with custom modes. Mine come with 3 different custom modes. So you're going to see me kind of set those up. So this is obviously this is not a bird shot. This is a landscape shot that I'm taking. But what I'd like to point out to you are just some of the settings here. So I'm shooting at f11 for my aperture, ISO of 100, auto white balance up here on the right-hand side. And I'm in aperture priority mode. So in the Canon, that is AV, aperture priority mode, and it's 1/40th of a second, which I am not setting because I'm in aperture priority. The camera's setting the 1/40th of a second for me. But again, I'm going to turn this on, and I'm going to go into the back of my camera, and I'm going to set these modes up for myself, these custom modes, so custom shooting modes. And I'm going to set this up as custom mode 2, or actually custom mode 3, I'm sorry. And let me go ahead and stop this again here in a second. So I'm registering this in the back of my camera as custom mode 3. Now I'm going to stop this, right? And I'm still in, you notice that nothing here has changed, but if I'm going to come over here now, I'm going to go to custom mode 3. And notice in custom mode 3, F11, ISO 100, auto white balance. So everything else is what I just showed you because that's what I just registered as custom mode 3, which is made from my aperture priority mode. Now watch what happens here as I go into custom mode 1. Now in custom mode 1, I'm in manual mode. I forgot to say this earlier, but now I'm shooting in burst. So this is my 30 frames per second. I'm shooting at 1/2000th of a second. Because this is made in manual mode, I am in control of this. F5.0, which is pretty wide open. Auto ISO, which that might catch your eye, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But now I am ready to go ahead and photograph birds. And why do I do this? Because I might be at a scene like this, which I'm shooting this beautiful landscape image. I have this beautiful S curve in the, in the marsh and what have you. And then maybe a bird lands over here. Maybe there's an osprey that's hunting. And instead of trying to fumble through all of these modes, all I have to do is go to custom mode 1, and all of my settings are preset. So now I'm ready to photograph birds immediately and right away. And so by using these custom settings in my camera, or setting these custom settings in my camera, I don't have to fumble around a whole lot. Everything is ready to go for me right away all the time. Now, I'll just also share with you that custom mode 3 for me is another aperture priority mode, but what it allows for is it's actually going to bracket the shots. And so it's not going to show up down below here, but I have 3 shots that I can bracket down there. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. But that custom mode 1 for me is my bird shooting mode. Custom mode 2 and 3 are my landscape mode. And all I got to do is move back and forth between the two, and I'm ready to shoot immediately and ready to go. Now, one of the things you may have seen there was ISO was auto, and that may be a bit controversial. You may not necessarily think, well, that doesn't make sense. But here's why I shoot in auto ISO almost all the time when I'm photographing my birds, and that is because I can't fix blurry. There's nothing more frustrating than being out in the field doing a whole bunch of shooting and you think you've nailed it, and you come back and you realize that your ISO setting was too low and your camera just didn't have the ability to be fast enough at that ISO in order to stop the bird in flight. And as a result, you end up with a blurry image that in post you can't fix. Now, I know what you may say, well, and I can go into topaz and I can sharpen it. Yeah, you can sharpen, but you can't sharpen blurry. That's a whole different level. You don't have the ability to do that. So let's talk about ISO here for a little bit. You've probably have all, are familiar with the exposure triangle. When I took my first photography lesson in San Diego back in like 1998 or something like that, I was told you want to have your shutter speed as low as, your ISO as low as possible so you can have a nice, crisp, sharp image without a lot of noise. And 25, 30 years ago, that was absolutely the case. And I would make the argument now that if you have control over the environment, that you should try to shoot as low as you can in your ISO, because yes, it does make a cleaner image and there's less work for you to do in post. However, with birds, they don't give you that ability to do that. In fact, wild bird photographers sort of live in this space: high shutter speeds and then very high ISOs, because you're trying to capture birds that are moving, and you're often trying to capture them in either low light, which is the morning or evening hours, or in unpredictable light, like a bird flying from a bright area to a shadowy area to the middle of the woods. And you don't have control over, where that bird is going to go. You don't have any control over the lighting situation in that situation. And you don't have the ability to change your ISO when you're photographing a bird in flight, unless you're super fast, right? Which I am not. So I shoot an auto ISO almost all the time. Now, there are times when I don't. If the bird is nesting, or if the bird is sitting and roosting, I know I have time, I'm going to dial in my own ISO, and I won't have to worry about auto ISO. But generally speaking, when we're out shooting wild birds in flight, we're going to be shooting an auto ISO all the time. So let me give you an example. Here's again, this is the gray ghost. It's not the same gray ghost, but this is a different gray ghost that I photographed a couple of years ago. You can see ISO of 2000. This was kind of in the middle of the day. That was pretty doable. Here's an eastern screech owl. I'm shooting this at 6:44 in the morning, which in the East Coast at certain times of the year is pretty dark. Like right now, the sun in New Hampshire rose this morning at 6:50. So if I was shooting this animal at 6:44 this morning, which is not the case here, but I would be shooting in pre-dawn hours, so it'd be pretty dark. So I have to be able to shoot relatively high ISOs. So here I'm shooting at 3200 ISO, f5.6, so fairly wide open and a pretty manageable shutter speed at 250th of a second. But this can just continue to grow. Here I am shooting at ISO 4000, knowing that I have this osprey returning to its nest, and I want to make sure that I freeze that action. So I want to have a high ISO so I know I'm going to get 2,000th of a second and freeze the osprey as he returns. Sometimes if you're in the forest floor, the canopy of the forest, the forest does not give you the amount of light that you would like to have. So it can be relatively dark on the forest floor. So again, you have to increase your shutter speed. Increase your ISO. And again, I'm shooting an auto ISO, so my camera's taking care of this. But in this instance, to shoot this blackpoll warbler, the correct ISO was 4,000. Here we are at the very bottom of the forest floor with this Carolina wren. And if you've ever photographed Carolina wrens, you know that they basically live in the little thickets and brush at the bottom of forests, and they are often in dark little crevices. So we're shooting an auto ISO again, but it comes out to 12,800. Another one, this beautiful little yellow warbler at 12,800. And then I'm coming back to this owl, which I showed you earlier, this eastern screech owl, which I shot at 25,600 ISO. Now, if you take a look at those settings there, 600 millimeters, that's my 600 millimeter fixed, 1/10 of a second at f4.5. I have pretty much maxed out the limitation of this lens at this point. It was almost a half hour after sunset. And in fact, you could not see this bird with the naked eye at this point. The only reason that I was able to photograph him was because I saw him move to this location, but while I had enough light, I was able to focus in on him, and then just continued to photograph it through the darkness, if you will. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do that was look at the pupils of this owl. Those pupils are dilated as wide as they're going to get, because he is able to see much better in the dark than I am, or as a result of those pupils dilating, he's able to see much better in the dark than I am. But that shot of those pupils just fully dilated is the one that I wanted to get, right? And so this is really kind of pushing everything to the max. 1/10 of a second, meaning he couldn't move really at all. f4.5, so I'm shooting basically as wide open as I can, although again, my lens would go to f4, but an ISO of 25,600. So that is pretty much at the limits of this. Now, if you really zoom in on this guy, the eyes are sharp, which is what you need. But as you get to the edges here, I'm losing some sharpness along the edges. If you can kind of look at the top here and along the side, it doesn't quite come out as crisp as I would like. But here, it doesn't really matter because, again, those eyes are super sharp, and it's all about those huge, dilated pupils. Now, what allows us to shoot at such sort of outrageous ISOs is the camera is able to do this with less noise than it would have otherwise, but also we also have great post-processing software. So here's a great blue heron that was fishing. So in this town next to where I live, we have a tidal river, and every year the river herring, they're called alewives, will run in the spring to their spawning grounds. And because the river is tidaled twice a day at low tide, pools are created, and the herring gets caught in these pools, and they're not able to continue to migrate. And literally, it's like fishing in a barrel. So we have herons and ospreys and bald eagles and just gulls and all sorts of different birds and animals. We have seals that come in at times, and they just have a feeding frenzy. And so it's a great opportunity to photograph these birds because A, they're going to be where the pools are, and B, that for about an hour or two each low tide, you have access to all these birds relatively close. So we have this great blue heron. He happened to be tucked away in a little bit of a dark corner. So this guy was shot at 12,800 ISO, and you can see all of the noise in this heron. So I use Topaz Photo AI. This is probably not going to be a surprise to a lot of you if you are understanding and do a lot of bird photography. Topaz has done a lot of work. This is actually an older screenshot of Topaz. They've done some upgrades since then. The point is that I can run a photo like this at 12,000 ISO or even the 25,000 ISO through Topaz and get a relatively clean image as a result. And this is the final image of that. Again, all of that noise is really taken care of. And because I wanted to make sure I got a nice sharp shot in shooting an auto ISO, I did get that nice sharp shot. And even as I zoom in, you really get a sense of how sharp that is and how well Topaz did in getting rid of a lot of that noise. So I'm going to come back to what I said earlier. You can't fix blurry, but you can fix noise, which is why we can tolerate these higher ISOs much more than we used to be able to. You can fix that noise, which you weren't able to do many, many years ago. That shot that I have, for example, of my first snowy owl, you can't shoot that because it's just not. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do back in 2014, whenever that image was taken, what I'm able to do now with post processing. All right, let's shift a little bit over to shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is uh, really indicative upon two things. One is the activity of your bird, and also, generally speaking, the size of the bird is going to play an impact in your shutter speed as well. And this is one thing that you do want to generally control. If I'm out shooting sort of in a sort of general bird in flight day, I'm always going to have my shutter speed at least 1,000th of a second. Oftentimes, if there's plenty of light, I'll be at 1,600th or 2,000th of a second. If there's plenty of light, there's not an issue anyway. But obviously, if your bird is in motion, you're going to need to be able to freeze that motion. So, the same owl, same day actually, you can just see everything else is equal here except this one's shooting at 1/4,000th of a second. So I can freeze the action of him hunting compared to 1/250th of a second when he's just sitting basking in the sun. But the size of the bird also does make a difference, generally speaking. So here we have a great blue heron and the black and white warbler, both shot at 1/1600th of a second. And you can see that the great blue heron, whose wings are very deliberate and much slower than our black and white warbler, they are totally frozen, totally tack sharp. Whereas the black and white warbler at 1/1600th of a second, they are not tack sharp. I'm not saying, by the way, that that is necessarily wrong. That can be a very nice creative feature to the work that you do. I would say that the head and specifically the eye has to be tack sharp, but sometimes the wings don't have to be, as would be the case with this lark sparrow, which I shot at 2,500th of a second. I actually think the blur of the wings contributes to the motion and the feeling of motion on this sparrow as it flew up over the branch like this. If you really want to begin these smaller birds, if you really want to get these birds tack sharp, you're talking about 4,000th of a second or maybe even 5,000th of a second. So the smaller the bird, the faster your shutter speed has to be. That being said, if you want to photograph an osprey or a peregrine falcon hunting, you better have a very fast shutter speed. So even though those are bigger birds than the sparrows and the warblers, you are going to have a fast shutter speed there. But generally speaking, as a general rule, the smaller the bird, the faster your shutter speed has to be if you want to freeze the action completely. The larger birds, you can have a little bit slower shutter speed, unless they're hunting like a peregrine falcon or an osprey or a northern harrier. So the other thing I would say about shutter speed is that you don't want your shutter speed to be the shutter speed of the image that you're looking at or the bird that you're looking at. You want the shutter speed to reflect the bird or the action or the behavior that you want to take the picture of, right? So in this first image up here to the left of the owl perched in the tree, I don't need 1/4000th of a second shutter speed. I just showed you a similar picture earlier at 1/250th of a second. If they're just sitting in the tree, that's fine. But my interest is not in taking a picture of him in the tree. My interest is in him hunting. And so you want to prepare for and plan for the picture that you want to create, not for the picture that's in front of you. So in order to freeze the hunting motion of the owl, I really want to make sure my shutter speed is as fast as it can be under the current, light conditions that we're in right now. And again, I chose 1/4000th of a second, maybe a little bit of an overkill for this. I probably would have been fine at 2,000th of a second. and that would have lowered my ISO. But again, I'm more comfortable shooting in higher ISOs now than I ever was. So I don't mind shooting at 6400. No, I can clean the image up afterwards. I would love to for the fifth photo in the set to be the owl actually pouncing on the vole, but unfortunately that's not the case. And I hope I don't disappoint everybody with this because ultimately the vole was behind a little hill and he pounced on it behind the hill and I didn't get that shot. Luckily, he basically retreated back to the same branch and we were able to, photograph him well, I guess it's a little bit of a mouse there or something like that, showing that he did actually, catch his prey. But I feel a little bit guilty that I don't have that fifth shot to show you. I really wish I did, obviously, because that would have been, the killer shot. The point, of course, is that we don't want to shoot. We don't. We're not setting our shutter speed for the shot that we're seeing or the image that we're seeing right away. We're setting our shutter speed for the image that we want to create. And so, while any picture of an eagle is awesome, I think the picture on the right is more compelling. And so I'm going to make sure that my shutter speed reflects the shot on the right more than the shot on the left. Again, shoot not for select your shutter speed not for the shot you're taking, but for the shot that you want. And this is just one last example that I want to show of this, and this is great blue herons. So in up here, we have great blue herons that will really disgusting, but they fish for these eels. It totally grosses me out every time I see because generally what happens is they'll catch the eel and the eel will wrap itself around the bill. And so what the great blue herons will do is that they will turn their head violently like this. And I've read somewhere that they do that to stun their prey, maybe even break. I've heard that they try to break their backs or break their bones so that they can't fight as strong as they would like to. But generally speaking, they're going to kind of reposition whatever it is that they catch. They always eat their fish or whatever they catch, or like head first because they want the gills. I mean, not the gills. I'm sorry. Well, the gills, yes, but also the scales of the fish going down and not in the opposite direction and being abrasive on the throat as it goes down. So they will always position it so it's eating head first. But again, they're going to swing their head violently like this to try to stun and break the backs of their prey. And so getting back to shutter speed, this is the shot that I knew was going to happen, or this was the action I knew was going to happen. This is the most interesting of the three shots. So I want to make sure my shutter speed was ready for that and not necessarily just for, the blue heron holding it. The last thing I want to, and sort of the last example I want to provide here again is another video. Now, this is an osprey nest. And again, note that the shutter speed is at 1600 here. And what you're going to see in this is the female osprey, and there's no sound here. What you don't see is that the male has returned. He's about 100 yards to the right in this picture, and he's eating. And she is getting agitated because he is not bringing the food over to her. And so she's squawking away. Again, there's no sound, so you're not going to hear that. But what I wanted, my image here that I wanted was the male returning to the nest with the fish. I don't need 1600th of a second to photograph this the female osprey in the nest. I needed 1600th of a second to make sure I froze the action of the male coming back. So I'm going to run this movie now, and what I want you to pay attention to is when the screen starts to flash, that's when I'm actually hitting my shutter. So everything else here is kind of the same that we've talked about earlier. I'm in manual mode, and I have I'm capturing 30 frames per second, all of that stuff. I've actually turned it on to one shot here, so I'm not doing I'm not actually following the bird. So I actually set up all of the focus, everything for this nest right here. I didn't have to worry about, I'm not chasing this bird as it flies across. I'm waiting for him to come back. And I want to make sure my shutter speed is such that I can freeze that motion as he does return. Let's go ahead and run the movie. And you're going to see here, and he's just about to arrive. The female's making room for him to return. And you'll see me start, there we go. And that's what I want, right? That's the return that I'm looking for. Let me go back here. So this is the return right here that I'm looking for. And so this is what I'm setting my shutter speed for. I'm not setting my shutter speed for that shot. I'm setting it for this shot, for the return of the male back to the nest. And then you're going to see that the female will take the. One thing I'll say about ospreys is that um, the female will almost always take the fish and fly off again. And I was hoping she would fly off towards me, but she didn't. She decided, as you'll see in a moment, fly in the opposite direction. So there wasn't a shot there to be had. But that's my thinking here is I'm focusing on the shot of him returning, and that's the shot that I ended up with in the end, right? So that this is where we're trying. This is where my settings are set. My settings are set for his return to the nest, not necessarily where he is right now, or not the female waiting there. It's for his return. It's a lot. If any of you are into sports photography, you want to think about this in the same way. If you're photographing baseball, for example, what I would often do is I would photograph or prepare for the play at first base. And so I'm going to set all my settings to photograph first base. And so then I just sit and wait for, a player to hit the ball and hopefully get to first base. And that's the shot that I want to take. So it's anticipatory in nature.
So can you go back to that photo? There's a question
Yeah.
that's here, so we don't have to go backwards later. Donna wants to know, she's curious why the osprey returning to the nest was shot at one shot instead of servo.
Oh, because the nest wasn't going to move. I knew the nest wasn't going to move. If I was photographing the bird flying, I would be in servo. But since I was stationary and the nest was going to be there, I didn't have to worry about that. And I'm going to get into this now. So this is a wonderful segue. I had plenty of depth of field. So I didn't worry too much about the bird as long as the bird, was coming in relatively parallel to my camera, which I knew he was going to. I had plenty of depth of field. So I didn't have to worry about shooting at servo because I wasn't following him. I was fixed on the nest, which is where he was returning to.
Thank
So
you.
that's a great question. Yep. All right, so let's geek out about aperture for a little bit here, focal length and depth of field. And so that was just a wonderful segue. Now I want to we're going to do a little bit of background on aperture here, and I want to give credit where credit is due, and that is that PhotoPills, in addition to being a wonderful app, is a great resource library, and they have this wonderful article on depth of field. And I would encourage folks to, if you really want to plunge into depth of field, as you're going to see, I pulled out some of the images that they used in that. They're more cartoons and drawings or what have you, but they have a lot more there. And so if you really want to get into this at that, point people to that article. So just as a reminder, the depth of field is going to be, or your focal plane is going to be that area that is acceptably sharp. And there's going to be some part between you and the camera and the thing that you're shooting that's not going to be sharp, and there's going to be something off in the distance that's not going to be sharp in most cases. So you have a very narrow focal plane. The other thing to keep in mind with your focal plane is that it is going to be perpendicular to your camera lens. So in this case here, because he's elevated and shooting down on the woman there, the potential exists for her feet to not be in focus if he's got a very wide open aperture. They don't say that on here, but the potential exists. This is important to keep in mind because your birds are not necessarily always going to be exactly perpendicular to you. And so, you may want to factor that in here as we talk about aperture as we make our way through here. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind around depth of field in aperture as it is germane to photographing birds. Now, the first thing is that the wider your f-stop, so f2.8, for example, here, the more narrow your depth of field. And as you work your way up towards f8, f11, f18, f22, so on and so forth, your depth of field is going to widen quite a bit, which is why in landscape photography, we're often shooting at f11 or greater. But in wildlife photography, we're often shooting at a much wider aperture. So our depth of field is going to narrow as our f-stop goes down. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The other thing to keep in mind is that the longer your lens, the more narrow your depth of field. So again, in landscape photography, a 50 millimeter lens by itself without worrying at all about aperture, because all of these apertures are at f8, is going to have a much wider depth of field than an 85 millimeter lens and a 200 millimeter lens, and certainly a 600 millimeter lens. So the further out we get with focal length, the more narrow that depth of field. And my guess is you're beginning to see kind of the position we may put ourselves in here, which is if we're shooting it really wide open, like f4, f4.5, f5, so whatever the case is, as we shoot more wide and with longer lenses, we have the potential to create such a narrow depth of field that the bird may or may not be fully in focus. And that's something we really want to be aware of. Now, the example I just showed you of the osprey, I had an aperture of 7.1, and I knew I was far enough away that was going to give me plenty of plenty of depth of field that the bird as it came in was going to be in focus. But if I was closer to that bird, I would have to really make sure that I gave myself plenty of depth of field. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that as the closer you are to your subject, the more narrow your depth of field is going to be. So it's really three things. It's how close are you to the subject, what is your aperture, and then what is the length of your lens. So the more wide open you are with a longer lens, and if you're super close to your subject, you're going to want to give yourself some grace. You're going to want to maybe shoot at f7.1, f8, even up to f11 to make sure that your subject is completely in focus, right? So let me give you some examples here. So this Savannah sparrow, again, not necessarily shooting totally wide open here, shooting at f6.3. The bird is really, really sharp, and we're still getting that beautiful bokeh behind. We're totally blurred out the background really nice, right? So we want to give ourselves some breathing room. We want to make sure that we understand kind of how the relationship between the distance to our subject and its background, how all of these things interplay. So let me give you a little bit of an example here. So here's a red-winged blackbird that I was pretty close to. Now and I'm sure you have areas near you. We have a little Audubon center near us that I can walk around in, and I don't do this, but families will show up and they have bird seeds, and the birds will come eat out of your hands, and it's all fine for kids, but I just, as a professional photographer, I just don't feel right about doing that. For the sake of this, I thought, let's use some of the bird seed that's there to kind of create an example here. So here I am shooting this red-winged blackbird, and he's maybe just a few feet away from me, and I'm pretty wide open at f5.6 here. And one of the things that I hope you notice, is that he's not completely in focus. The tail is way out of focus. The head is kind of in focus, but you can see even this back leg right here, this leg underneath the wing is out of focus. So this interaction between the space between you and the bird, and your focal length and your aperture, these are all things you have to consider. The closer you are, the more grace you're going to want to give yourself, so that you aren't necessarily ending up with a part of the bird in focus and part of the bird not in focus. You really want to make sure that you have a wide enough depth of field. So here's an example, peregrine falcon. I'm not going to get too close to a peregrine falcon. They're not going to come close to me. I'm shooting 840 millimeters. He's way off in the distance, so I can pretty much shoot pretty wide open here. And again, coming back to that guy, I don't know why that guy was there. I'm sorry. I think that was an old slide. Here's a merlin. Merlins are beautiful birds. They hunt small birds and insects and what have you. But again, he's so far away. I can shoot at f4 and he's going to be fully in focus. But if I was too close to him, I would need to make sure that I gave myself some grace. So shooting when it comes to photographing birds and photographing in different types of light, that's all really important. Obviously, there's backlighting, there's front lighting, there's side lighting, there's all sorts of things. The general rule is you want the sun behind you. You want to be between the sun and your subject when it comes to photographing birds. But that's not to say you can't create super creative and awesome images with a backlit bird. I'm just saying that generally speaking, that's sort of the golden rule. But I also love the idea of this concept that I've come up with called celebration light. And celebration light is not light that happens out in the field. These two images, these are the same images, this same bird. The one on the left is the raw image. The one on the right is when I got done post-processing with it. And what I love to do in post-processing is I love to celebrate the bird. So let me kind of give you some examples of this. This is obviously a little yellow warbler, just the cutest little bird that might be out there. And what you may not be able to see is that I have used a little bit of a mask, um, and I have brightened the area around the head of the bird and making it look like there's a light source that's coming down, from the top left of this little guy right here. And the difference is subtle, but here's the original image, or this was, excuse me, processed, but I didn't include the celebration light. And here's the celebration light afterwards. So we're not talking about making a major difference here. We're not talking about creating a situation where he looks like he's totally in a spotlight. We're just trying to put a little bit of light and a little bit of celebration on the bird. So I do this in post-processing a lot. So here's another example, right? We have a red-winged blackbird proudly boasting his presence on this little twig. And there is my mask that I'm going to put over the top of it. And you can see the end result there. Again, we're not talking about a major difference. We're just celebrating that bird just a little bit. Here's the Merlin I showed you earlier. Here's our and what I try to do is I try to have them facing the light as much as possible. And so there is our final image right there. Again, just a little bit of celebration. So one of the things that I try not to do is I try not to shoot just the bird in the box a whole lot. The bird in the box is that bird that is, you take a picture of it and you don't even know where it is. So I like to include part of the environment as part of the shot as much as possible. As a matter of fact, I'll be giving this presentation at the Outer Chicago Live Conference this year. It's going to be called Small Birds, Big Stories, and that is shooting birds smaller in the frame and telling the larger story of the ecosystem and where it is and what have you. And so I'm really gaining a lot of interest and passion about kind of this larger story that our birds live in. So I think it's really important that you include part of the atmosphere, part of the surroundings, part of the ecosystem in with your shots. If you're, I love these short-eared owls. The short-eared owls are just like our snowy owls. They come down in the winter and they visit us and they shoot. They hunt. They are crepuscular in that they shoot they hunt in the morning and they hunt at night or at dawn and dusk. And they are just a blast to shoot. But I want to be able to, when I photograph these guys, I want to be able to show where they're hunting and, just their kind of personality that goes along with it. I don't know how don't include flowers as you're shooting orioles. Oh man, this little indigo bunting, I was sitting on a bench one day and he came flying up right next to me and I was like, really, you're going to do this for me? And I just, I was able to capture that image. But I just love photographing birds within their context, if you will, within their environment. These little marsh wrens, and there's certainly these great blue herons. I love photographing them in the marsh. The night herons are a bit more recluse. They aren't necessarily going to be out as much as those great blue herons are. So kind of photographing this guy deep in the bushes was fun. Camouflage is something that's always fun to be able to show in birds. And then one last thing I'll talk about here. I'm not sure I probably won't get to post-processing. I apologize for that. But behavior is also key. Compelling bird images come with shooting their behaviors as well. So hunting is obviously a great way to photograph birds in their environment. This unfortunate Canada goose was the meal for this juvenile bald eagle. We talked a little bit about the river herring that we have, and one of the things that I learned in the last couple of years is that our great blue herons don't always snatch their fish. Sometimes they spear them, like this guy has. These little owls have such a wonderful personality. This is kind of a cool image, but I like this one better. Like, what are you doing here? And then certainly hunting. This plover, unfortunately, had a tough day. Um, the peregrine falcon found himself a breakfast, and osprey, obviously. So anytime you can find them in behavior, it makes for a more compelling image. This is a nice picture of a cedar waxwing. This is a better picture of a cedar waxwing, right? So catching that behavior is really makes for a much more compelling image. Um, During the spring and summer, you have um, birds that are going to feed other birds, whether they be the males feeding the females, or in this case, we have an adult song sparrow, not song sparrow, marsh sparrow feeding one of its young. That's always a good thing to find. Um, this was some barred owls that we had that nested near us, and I'll just let this play out here. Watching them interact with their little ones was just a blast. And you can see in the bottom now the little ones were just about to fledge, and they're getting a little bit more brave, coming out of the nest just a little bit more each time, which was just so much fun to watch. If you can find a nest like this and really study it for a while, it's such a blast. This guy's going to go back in, and his nest mate's going to come back in or come back out here in just a moment. Yeah, these guys were a blast. And then, when you're out there and you get to see mom bringing food to the young. What owls do also is they will cache their food. So if they catch their squirrels, they're going to cache them somewhere, and they're going to go out and get them afterwards to bring back to the nest and feed them. So all of these behaviors are just such a blast to be able to photograph and to catch them feeding their young. It's just a wonderful thing. um, Mating season is always interesting, right? The mating of birds is a very fast act. It usually only lasts a few seconds, and you have to be patient for it to happen, and you got to be ready for it to happen. Um, Ospreys, I've studied them enough to know that the female osprey makes a lot of noise when she is ready for copulation. The male is going to fly off and do a little bit of a victory lap, and when he comes back, he won't land on the twig. He'll land right on the back of the female. So my point here is that you really need to be observant. You need to know kind of their rituals. And so in this case here, knowing that he was going to land right on her back for copulation was something I needed to be ready for. And then these two eagles live nearby, and I was very lucky in this case to have the female facing me, because when they copulated, I was able to capture that image, which was just sort of the star of the day that day. So being able to capture that image and having the male mount the female, have them both looking in my direction was, just one of those moments that just felt really a lot of gratitude to be able to have them there. And since I have your attention now, since we're talking about sex, I want to put a plug in for my calendar if you don't mind. Um, the as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of landscape work, and every year I put out a calendar. And this is actually fresh off the printer. I picked it up from the printer today, and it's a little bit of a different style. I do 12 different pages. It's not a ringed, it's not bound like that. It's like 12 different pieces of art that I make available for folks. So if you're interested in helping support me, that would be wonderful. You can go to tb3photography.com and my 2025 calendar to get that. So I'm going to put one thing up here just at the end, so you have my contact information. I apologize that we were not able to get to a lot on post-processing, but Linda, I'd love to come back and do one on post-processing. So I can see you're scheming that already, so that's wonderful. But that's my contact information. So if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. And thank you. And
I have a couple
see
of
if there's any
questions.
questions.
I've
Yeah.
got a couple questions for you, which I'll throw in there. And yes, I would love for you to come back and do a post processing on your bird photography. But before everybody came in the room, we talked about you coming back for a landscape. So I'm just going to say I'm calling you on both of those.
All right.
And
Consider me booked.
that's how it works, people. All right, two
Perfect.
questions. Jamie has she's got questions. So you had flipped over from the ospreys and I missed it, it went too fast. But she says she noticed that the focus stayed on the nest and not the bird because her question is because it was in the same plane, is that acceptable?
Yes. Yeah. And I had enough grace with my depth of field. So my aperture was a 7.1, and I knew I was far enough away. I was probably 50 yards away from the nest. And so I knew with that distance and at 7.1, I was going to have a wide enough focal plane to be able to pull that off. Yes.
Perfect. And then this is where did my little question go? Um, it's kind of a selfish question for Jamie, but this applies because she is heading kind of in your direction. She's wanting to
Yeah.
know winter birds. What will she
Yep.
see along the coast next week?
Um, this is our cruise to Maine and beyond, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think
Um, so let's see. Um, well, you should have plenty of, well, certainly plenty of gulls. That's for sure. You'll have plenty of gulls. Um, you may have some alcids, which are, if as you get up into Halifax and north, you might start getting into some of the puffins. You might see some of those if you're lucky. Um, let's see what I'm trying to think of. I mean, it kind of depends on how far off you are in your cruise. Um, in Portland, you may be able to see some peregrine falcons because they do live in the cities, so that's always a fun find. Um, I don't know if you'll be able to see the any snowy owls. They are probably not going to be found where you are. Let me think here a little bit. I would look for eagles. Eagles tend to go to the coast in the winter. Our ponds up here freeze. Ponds and lakes freeze, and so they begin to migrate to the coast in the winter. So there's a good chance we might have some eagles over at the coast as well. Yeah.
perfect. That gives you something to look forward to, Jamie.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of very nice comments in here, and I'll be certain to share the chat with you, Tony. Um,
Thanks.
there's a I'm going to quote you from Claire, who says, "Thank you, Tony. Best takeaway is shoot what you want, not what you see," and
Yeah.
that is something that resonated with me as well. And that I can't remember now. Not the magic light. What did you call it? The um,
Celebration light.
celebration light. Sorry,
Yeah.
I kind of glanced at something and then I lost the word.
Yep.
A couple of us are very excited about that. So yes,
Good.
once I saw you do that, when you were just kind of edging into some post processing, I'm like, I wonder how I can get him to come back to do. So I didn't even have to work that hard, John Fisher.
No,
That's how it works.
we'll
So
do it.
so, Tony, thanks for doing this for us. This was really wonderful. I'm very excited to see that you are starting your photography business, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank
Um,
you.
all right, with that, let me go ahead and close out this session. Next week, Jack Carney will join us with his presentation, The Art of Composing Waterfalls, Workflow,
Mm.
Capture, and Post-Processing. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you again soon.